Good evening. I'm Alex Mercer. We're coming on the air due to confirmed reports of sudden U.S. military operations in the Arctic region, specifically involving Greenland. Information is incomplete. What follows is based on official statements, Allied responses, and corroborated reporting available at this hour. At approximately 21:40 Eastern Time, residents in parts of northern Greenland began reporting unusual aircraft activity. That was followed within the hour by acknowledgments from U.S. defense officials that American forces had initiated what was described as a limited, time-sensitive operation to secure strategic assets. That language is theirs. I'll read the statement as released by the Department of Defense moments ago. Earlier this evening, United States forces conducted a focused military operation in the Arctic region in response to emerging security concerns. The operation is limited in scope, defensive in intent, and aimed at safeguarding critical infrastructure. Further details will be provided as the situation develops. That is the full statement. No mention of consultation with allies. No reference to NATO coordination. Local authorities in Greenland, which is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, say they were not notified in advance. Danish officials confirm that assessment. The Prime Minister of Denmark released a brief statement about 30 minutes ago. I'll read it verbatim. Denmark has not consented to any military action on or above Greenlandic territory. We regard the use of force without coordination as a serious breach of trust and of established security arrangements. At this stage, there are no confirmed reports of casualties. Greenlandic emergency services say they are assessing potential impacts near airfields and communications facilities in the northwest of the island. Eyewitness accounts are circulating online. Some of these include video showing low-flying aircraft and what appear to be controlled detonations near remote installations. These videos have not been independently verified. Analysts caution that distances and scale are difficult to judge in Arctic terrain, particularly under low-light conditions. To understand why this matters, a brief explanation. Greenland hosts radar systems, satellite ground stations, and undersea cable junctions critical to North Atlantic communications and early warning networks. Control of these systems has long been considered strategically significant, particularly as Arctic shipping lanes open due to climate change. The Arctic is not a vacuum. It is governed by treaties, alliances, and long-standing assumptions of cooperation. That brings us to NATO. Within hours of the first reports, emergency consultations were requested by multiple NATO member states. This is highly unusual given that the United States is not only a member, but the alliance's principal military power. Shortly before midnight, Brussels time, NATO's Secretary General issued a statement. Again, I'll read it directly. The North Atlantic Council is meeting an emergency session to assess reports of unilateral military action by a member state on Allied territory. Alliance principles require consultation, proportionality, and collective decision-making. That wording is careful, but the implications are significant. Several member states have gone further. Officials from Germany, France, Canada, and Norway have issued coordinated condemnations, describing the action as a violation of collective defense norms. A senior European diplomat, speaking on background, characterized the mood as shock followed by disbelief. For historical context, NATO has faced internal disputes before. The Suez Crisis in 1956, France's withdrawal from NATO's Integrated Command in 1966, the Iraq War in 2003. In none of those cases did the alliance formally consider one of its founding members as a potential hostile actor. That is what makes the next development unprecedented. In the past hour, NATO confirmed that Article 4 consultations, which address threats to alliance security, have been formally invoked. Multiple sources indicate that alliance mechanisms typically reserved for external threats are now being discussed in relation to the United States itself. This does not mean military action. It does not mean war between allies. It does mean that the foundational assumption that the alliance moves together has been fractured. Back in Washington, the White House has not yet addressed the nation. A senior administration official, speaking anonymously, told reporters that the operation was driven by credible intelligence of imminent risk to Arctic assets. No evidence has been publicly presented to support that claim. Experts in international law are already weighing in. Under NATO agreements, military activity on Allied territory generally requires host nation consent or an imminent self-defense justification. The threshold for that justification is high. From a technical standpoint, Arctic operations are complex. Weather limits visibility. Communications are vulnerable to interference. Small actions can have outsized consequences due to the concentration of infrastructure. A misinterpreted radar signal, a disrupted satellite link, a severed undersea cable. Those are not hypothetical concerns. Similar incidents have occurred during the Cold War, particularly in the North Atlantic and Barents Sea regions, where close military activity led to near misses and escalation scares. International response is moving quickly. The European Union has called for an emergency meeting of foreign ministers. Canada has placed its Arctic forces on heightened readiness, described as precautionary. Russia and China have both issued statements urging restraint, each noting the risks of militarization in the Arctic. Statements that analysts note are diplomatically pointed, given their own activities in the region. The United Nations Secretary General released a short message emphasizing respect for sovereignty and the urgent need for de-escalation. Markets are reacting. Energy futures are volatile. Shipping insurers are reassessing Arctic routes. These are early indicators, but they reflect uncertainty rather than immediate crisis. For listeners here in the United States, practical guidance at this stage is limited. There is no indication of domestic military mobilization, no changes to civil aviation advisories, no alerts from the Department of Homeland Security beyond routine monitoring. What is advisable is informational caution. Rely on official sources. Be wary of unverified footage and speculation, particularly on social platforms where Arctic imagery is often misattributed or recycled from previous exercises. This is a developing situation. Facts are still emerging. Statements are being carefully worded, and in some cases, withheld. What is clear is that this marks a significant departure from established norms of Allied coordination. Even if the operation remains limited, the political and strategic consequences are likely to extend far beyond Greenland. We will continue to monitor official briefings, alliance statements, and independent analysis through the night. As always, Silent Waves remains on the air. This is Alex Mercer. Stay with us. We are continuing our extended coverage on Silent Waves. This is Alex Mercer. The situation in the Arctic is escalating, and the language coming out of official channels has shifted noticeably in the past hour. Radio traffic monitored by civilian aviation authorities now confirms widespread airspace closures over northern Greenland. Commercial flights have been rerouted. Search and rescue aircraft have been grounded. Notices to airmen, known as NOTAMs, describe the region as temporarily unavailable due to military activity. Greenlandic airport officials report sudden loss of contact with several Arctic installations. In plain terms, some bases have gone dark. that does not necessarily indicate damage. It may reflect intentional shutdowns of communications to prevent interference or targeting. But the effect is the same: reduced visibility into what is happening on the ground. Multiple defense correspondents are now reporting activation of missile defense systems in the high north. These are largely defensive platforms, radar-linked interceptors designed to track and, if necessary, neutralize incoming threats. Their activation suggests that planners are accounting for worst-case scenarios, even if no missiles have been launched. Again, there are no confirmed strikes beyond the initial U.S. operation, no verified casualties, but the posture has changed. Unverified footage continues to circulate. Short clips showing vertical launch systems lighting up against the Arctic sky. Radar screens with unidentified tracks. Audio claimed to be emergency radio chatter in Danish and English. We cannot independently confirm these materials. Analysts caution that similar imagery is often drawn from past exercises or unrelated tests. Still, the volume and timing of these reports are contributing to a broader picture of heightened readiness. What is increasingly clear is that the Arctic is no longer being treated as a peripheral theater. Naval sources now confirm deployments of ice-capable warships from multiple countries into the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, a strategic corridor long monitored for submarine activity. This region was a focal point during the Cold War, when NATO and Soviet forces tracked each other beneath the ice. Submarines operate there today. So do long-endurance drones designed to loiter for days in extreme cold. None of this is inherently new. What is new is the density and speed of deployment. Military analysts describe this as compression. Too many assets in too constrained a space, operating under high tension. That increases the risk of miscalculation. From a technical standpoint, Arctic warfare presents unique challenges. Magnetic navigation is unreliable near the pole. Satellite coverage is intermittent. Ice conditions shift rapidly. Command decisions often rely on incomplete data. That matters because reaction times shorten. Decisions that might take hours elsewhere can be compressed into minutes. Now to Copenhagen. Approximately 20 minutes ago, the Danish government made a move without precedent in NATO's history. Denmark has formally invoked Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the Collective Defense Clause, citing the U.S. military action in Greenland as an armed attack on Danish sovereign territory. I want to be precise here. Article 5 has been invoked only once before, after the attacks of September 11, 2001, in defense of the United States. Tonight, it has been invoked against it. The Danish Prime Minister addressed the nation briefly. I will read the statement verbatim. Denmark has exhausted all diplomatic channels. The use of force on Greenland without consent constitutes an attack on the Kingdom of Denmark. In accordance with our obligations and rights under the North Atlantic Treaty, we have requested collective defense measures. That is the entirety of the statement. No qualifiers, no timelines. NATO headquarters has acknowledged receipt of the request. Alliance officials stress that invocation does not automatically authorize military action. It initiates consultations. But the legal and symbolic weight is substantial. Several member states have confirmed participation in emergency deliberations. Others are withholding comment. In Washington, response has been muted. The Pentagon reiterated that operations remain limited and defensive. The White House has scheduled a briefing for later this morning, Eastern Time. International reaction is accelerating. Canada has reiterated support for Denmark's sovereignty while urging de-escalation. The United Kingdom has called for immediate clarification from Washington. Germany has suspended joint military exercises pending review. Russia has convened its Security Council. China's foreign ministry issued a statement warning that alliances must not become sources of instability. Neither country has announced direct military movements, but both have increased reconnaissance activity in the Arctic in recent years. For comparison, the closest historical parallel may be the Cuban Missile Crisis, not in scale, but in structure. Rapid military actions, limited information, and decisions made under compressed timelines with global consequences attached. The difference is that this crisis involves allies, not adversaries. For listeners, especially those with family in military service or Arctic research, uncertainty is understandably high. At this time, there are no evacuation orders for civilian populations in Greenland beyond standard safety advisories. Danish authorities emphasize preparedness, not panic. Emergency shelters are being checked. Communications redundancy is being restored where possible. Here in the United States, no changes have been announced to national alert levels. Travel advisories relate only to Arctic regions. This remains a fluid situation. Words like siege and battlefield are appearing in headlines, but officials continue to describe actions as precautionary and defensive. Those descriptions may evolve. We will continue monitoring verified statements, alliance decisions, and technical assessments as they emerge. This is Silent Waves on Lost Signal Radio. I'm Alex Mercer. We stay with the signal. The situation in the Arctic continues to deteriorate, both militarily and diplomatically. The gap between official statements and observable developments is widening. Within the last hour, U.S. defense officials have confirmed what they describe as a forward movement of American forces in Greenland. The Pentagon insists this does not constitute an expansion of operations, but rather a consolidation of positions already secured. That interpretation is not shared by European leaders. A joint statement issued by France, Germany, and the Netherlands warns that continued U.S. advances risk triggering uncontrollable escalation within alliance territory. The wording is deliberate. It avoids accusation, but it clearly rejects Washington's framing. A senior NATO military planner speaking anonymously summarized the divide this way. One side sees stabilization, the other sees momentum. Pentagon briefings emphasize defensive necessity. European responses emphasize sovereignty and precedent. Neither side is backing down. Diplomatic channels are now described by multiple sources as largely unresponsive. Emergency calls between capitals have shortened. Several scheduled meetings have been postponed or downgraded to technical level contacts. That is usually an indicator that political space is narrowing. On the ground in Greenland, the human impact is becoming visible. Danish authorities have confirmed the start of civilian evacuations from several remote communities in northern and western Greenland. These are small settlements, many accessible only by air or seasonal sea routes. Supply flights have been suspended due to airspace restrictions. Ice conditions have complicated maritime access. In plain terms, some communities can no longer be reliably reached. Evacuations are being described as precautionary. Residents are being relocated southward, where infrastructure is more resilient. Officials stress that there is no immediate threat to civilians, but they acknowledge that continuity of food, fuel, and medical supplies cannot be guaranteed under current conditions. Local radio transmissions from Greenlandic stations, relayed through Danish networks, describe orderly departures, limited capacity, and significant uncertainty. Families are being separated temporarily. Livestock is being left behind. These are not mass movements, but they are consequential for communities already living at the edge of logistical feasibility. From a technical perspective, Arctic supply chains are fragile by design. They rely on narrow weather windows, limited storage, and predictable air corridors. Once those corridors close, alternatives are scarce. That brings us back to the airspace. Multiple NATO member states have now confirmed that their air forces are conducting patrols over the high north. Fighter aircraft from Canada, Norway, the United Kingdom, and several European countries are operating under NATO command authority. These patrols are not exercises. They are described as air policing missions, intended to assert alliance airspace control and monitor U.S. military movements. In effect, NATO aircraft and American aircraft are now operating in overlapping zones, with different command structures and sharply diverging political mandates. There have been no confirmed close encounters, no reports of lock-ons or warning maneuvers, but the density of activity is increasing. Air defense experts note that modern fighters rely heavily on sensor fusion, radar, infrared, data links to maintain situational awareness. When multiple forces operate simultaneously, deconfliction becomes critical. That usually requires coordination. At present, coordination is limited. Several European air forces have acknowledged operating in direct opposition to U.S. forces. That phrase comes from an official briefing released by the Norwegian Ministry of Defense. It refers not to hostile engagement, but to countervailing presence. Presence matters. Historically, aerial confrontations between allies are rare, but not unheard of. During the Cold War, NATO aircraft occasionally shadowed one another during disputes over airspace boundaries. Those incidents were tense, but contained. The difference now is the political context. This is not a disagreement at the margins. It is a dispute over authority and legitimacy. International reaction continues to expand. The Arctic Council has suspended all non-essential meetings. Several neutral states have offered mediation. None have been accepted so far. Global shipping associations are advising members to avoid Arctic routes entirely. Satellite operators report increased interference and are adjusting orbital tasking priorities. For listeners, particularly those in military families or involved in Arctic research and industry, the most important point remains this: there is no indication of imminent large-scale conflict. But the safeguards that usually prevent miscalculation are under strain. Officials on all sides continue to use restrained language. That restraint is deliberate. It suggests awareness of the stakes. At the same time, actions on the ground and in the air are accelerating faster than diplomacy. This is often the most unstable phase of any crisis. The effects of this crisis are now extending well beyond the Arctic. What began as a geographically isolated military operation is registering across global systems that are tightly coupled and highly sensitive to disruption. Global markets reacted sharply as Asian trading opened, followed by Europe. Energy prices moved first. Brent crude and natural gas futures spiked on concerns about Arctic transit routes and upstream infrastructure vulnerability. These moves are not driven by physical shortages at this hour, but by risk modeling. Traders are pricing uncertainty, not loss. Shipping followed. Several major maritime insurers have suspended coverage for high-latitude routes, citing unquantifiable exposure. This has immediate consequences for container traffic, bulk commodities, and specialized vessels that rely on Arctic shortcuts to reduce transit time between Asia, Europe, and North America. Rerouting adds days or weeks. That cost propagates. Communications firms are reporting intermittent disruptions affecting satellite-dependent services. These include remote broadband, aviation navigation backups, and time synchronization systems used by financial networks. Most outages are brief, but the pattern is irregular, and that alone is enough to trigger safeguards and slowdowns. Central banks and finance ministries have issued coordinated statements emphasizing liquidity readiness and continuity planning. The language is calm. It is meant to be. This is not a market crash scenario. It is a stress scenario, and stress reveals weak points. That brings us to Washington. In the past several hours, details have begun to emerge about internal deliberations that preceded the Greenland operation. These details come from leaked intelligence summaries circulating among Allied services and confirmed in part by U.S. officials who spoke under condition of anonymity. According to these materials, Greenland was identified as a strategic choke point across 3 domains: resources, surveillance, and access. First, resources. Beneath Greenland's ice are significant deposits of rare earth elements, critical for advanced electronics, renewable energy systems, and military hardware. As global supply chains tighten and competition with China intensifies, access to these materials has become a priority across multiple administrations, not just this one. Second, surveillance. Greenland's position allows for early detection of missile launches and space activity across the polar arc. Control of radar and satellite uplink facilities there extends visibility deep into Eurasian airspace and orbital paths. In a world where warning time is shrinking, minutes matter. Third, access. As Arctic ice retreats, the region is becoming navigable for longer periods each year. Whoever controls logistics hubs, ports, and communication nodes controls movement. That is not speculation. That is doctrine. Leaked assessments suggest U.S. planners feared that these advantages were eroding, not necessarily to allies, but to competitors operating in gray zones through investment, dual-use research, and infrastructure agreements. The conclusion drawn by those planners, according to the leaks, was that delay carried greater long-term risk than unilateral action. European leaders reject that logic. They argue that alliance coordination was the very mechanism designed to manage such risks collectively. Their concern is not only what was done, but how precedent now shifts. Inside the White House, officials describe a compressed decision cycle driven by intelligence warnings of imminent compromise of Arctic systems. That phrase appears repeatedly in the documents. What exactly it refers to has not been publicly clarified. What is clear is that the decision fractured trust, and now that fracture is extending upward into space. Within the last 90 minutes, multiple satellite operators have confirmed anomalies affecting Arctic-facing assets. Several Earth observation satellites have stopped transmitting telemetry. Others report degraded signal quality consistent with interference. Space agencies are careful with their language. They describe these events as temporary loss of contact and suspected environmental or technical causes. But defense analysts are more direct. They say this looks like jamming. In plain terms, jamming overwhelms a signal with noise. It does not destroy satellites. It blinds them temporarily. In low Earth orbit, that blindness can recur with every pass over a contested region. The implications are serious. Satellites support weather forecasting, navigation, communications, missile warning, and scientific monitoring. Losing them, even intermittently, reduces situational awareness. It forces militaries to rely on older, less precise systems. It increases uncertainty. Cyber specialists also warn that orbital systems are tightly linked to ground networks. Interference in one domain often coincides with probing in another. There is no public evidence of a coordinated cyber attack at this stage, but defensive postures have been elevated across multiple countries. For historical context, space interference has occurred before. During conflicts and tests, signals have been disrupted intentionally and unintentionally. What is different now is scale and simultaneity. Multiple operators, multiple nations, a shared theater. The fear expressed quietly by officials is escalation across domains. Land, sea, air, space, and cyber are no longer separate arenas. They interact, and interaction creates complexity. Back in Greenland, conditions remain tense but controlled. Evacuations continue at a measured pace. Danish authorities emphasize that relocation sites are prepared, that medical care is available, and that no community is being abandoned. Still, the psychological toll is evident. Arctic communities are accustomed to isolation, but not displacement driven by geopolitical conflict. Military activity remains visible but restrained. Aircraft patrols continue. Naval movements persist under ice and along ice edges. There are no confirmed engagements. That absence matters. Experts in crisis stability point out that the most dangerous moments are not when fighting begins, but when everyone is waiting for someone else to blink. International diplomacy is struggling to catch up. Emergency sessions continue at NATO, the European Union, and the United Nations. Proposals range from observer missions to joint verification mechanisms to temporary demilitarized zones around key infrastructure. None have yet gained consensus. The United States maintains that its actions are temporary and reversible. European leaders respond that trust, once broken, is not easily restored. Public messaging remains cautious. No leader is using language of war. That restraint is deliberate and necessary. But systems are now in motion that are difficult to stop quickly. For listeners, especially those far from the Arctic, it may feel abstract. Satellites flicker, markets adjust, headlines scroll, but the core issue is concrete. How power is exercised in a crowded, interconnected world where margins for error are narrowing. There is still time for de-escalation. There are still channels, however strained. History shows that crises involving allies can be resolved, but only when action slows enough for diplomacy to reassert itself. Whether that slowdown occurs here is not yet clear. We will remain on the air, monitoring verified developments across military, diplomatic, economic, and technical domains as this situation evolves. This is Silent Waves. We are continuing extended coverage of the unfolding Arctic crisis. I'm Alex Mercer. As the situation widens, attention is now turning to a country positioned both geographically and politically at the center of this confrontation: Canada. Ottawa finds itself facing a convergence of pressures unlike any in recent history. Canada is an Arctic nation. It is a founding NATO member, and it shares the world's longest undefended border with the United States. Each of those facts, taken alone, is manageable. Taken together, under current conditions, they present what Canadian officials privately describe as an impossible alignment problem. Canadian radar and early warning systems are integrated with those of the United States through NORAD. That integration is deep, technical, and continuous. It does not switch off easily. At the same time, Canada is bound by NATO commitments that now place it in formal consultation against American actions in Greenland. Publicly, the Canadian government is striking a careful tone. The Prime Minister's office released a statement emphasizing steadfast commitment to alliance principles, Arctic stability, and continental defense. The statement avoids assigning blame. It avoids endorsement. That balance is deliberate. Behind the scenes, however, Canadian defense planners are confronting hard choices. Air patrols over the Canadian Arctic have been increased. Naval assets are repositioning to ensure sovereignty. Patrols remain uninterrupted. None of this is described as hostile. All of it is precautionary. The concern is spillover. If airspace becomes congested, if undersea activity increases, if command and control systems are stressed, Canada becomes not a bystander, but a buffer. Buffers absorb pressure. Historically, Canada has played a moderating role in transatlantic disputes. During the Cold War, it often served as a quiet intermediary, but those moments did not involve the alliance turning inward at this scale. Canadian officials have acknowledged receiving diplomatic outreach from both Washington and European capitals. They are listening. They are not committing. From a technical standpoint, Canada's Arctic infrastructure is limited. Long distances, sparse populations, and extreme weather mean response times are slow by design. That reality incentivizes caution. Any misstep in the region has amplified consequences. For Indigenous and northern communities, the anxiety is immediate. Supply chains are fragile. Communications depend heavily on satellite links already under strain. Local leaders are calling for assurances that civilian needs will not be overshadowed by strategic calculations. Ottawa has promised exactly that. Whether it can deliver under sustained pressure remains an open question. While Canada navigates between alliance obligations and geographic realities, attention is also shifting east and south to powers that are not directly involved, but are far from passive. Russia and China are watching closely, and they are moving. Russian authorities have confirmed increased activity along their northern coast. This includes patrols by icebreakers, Arctic-capable naval vessels, and long-range aviation flights within Russian airspace. Moscow insists these movements are routine and defensive. They may be routine. The timing is not. Russia has spent years expanding its Arctic infrastructure, ports, airfields, radar stations, framing these efforts as economic development and sovereignty protection. The current fracture within NATO presents an opportunity to test boundaries without crossing them. Defense analysts describe this as positional advancement, not confrontation, but presence, establishing facts on the ground or under the ice that become harder to reverse later. China's approach is different, but no less deliberate. Beijing does not border the Arctic, but it has declared itself a near-Arctic state. In recent years, it has invested heavily in polar research stations, satellite coverage, and commercial partnerships tied to Arctic shipping routes and resource extraction. In the past 24 hours, Chinese state media has increased coverage of the Greenland crisis, emphasizing alliance instability and the risks of militarization. Official statements call for restraint, multilateralism, and respect for international law. At the same time, Chinese maritime authorities have announced expanded polar research deployments. Satellite operators linked to Chinese firms report increased tasking over high-latitude regions. Again, nothing overtly aggressive, everything carefully framed. The concern among Western analysts is not immediate intervention, but long-term leverage. When alliances fracture, influence flows into the gaps. Historically, moments like this reshape strategic landscapes, not through decisive battles, but through accumulated adjustments, new patrol routes, new baselines, new norms. The Arctic has long been governed by a principle of low tension. Even during periods of global rivalry, it was treated as a space where cooperation outweighed confrontation. Scientific collaboration continued. Search and rescue agreements held. Military signaling was restrained. That equilibrium is now under strain. What makes this moment particularly unstable is simultaneity. Military movement, diplomatic breakdown, market reaction, satellite disruption, all occurring at once, reinforcing one another. Experts in escalation dynamics note that complexity itself is a risk factor. The more systems interact, the harder it becomes to predict outcomes. And prediction is what decision makers rely on to avoid catastrophe. At this hour, no country is declaring war. No leader is issuing ultimatums. That restraint matters. But so do actions taken quietly, incrementally, justified as temporary or defensive. Canada's dilemma, Russia's positioning, China's engagement. These are not side stories. They are indicators of how the global system responds when a central alliance falters. For listeners, especially those distant from the Arctic, the significance may not be immediately visible. But the Arctic is not remote in functional terms. It underpins communications, climate monitoring, navigation, and security architectures that extend worldwide. Disruption there does not stay there. This remains a developing situation. Information continues to arrive unevenly. Statements are issued cautiously. Some questions remain unanswered by design. We will continue to track verified developments, expert assessments, and official communications as this crisis evolves. This is Silent Waves. I'm Alex Mercer. The signal remains open. The crisis now reaches a point that many defense planners once considered theoretical. Multiple European defense officials have confirmed that NATO naval commanders are actively debating the feasibility of a maritime containment operation in the North Atlantic. The word blockade is being used cautiously, often avoided altogether in public-facing language, but internally the concept is under discussion. The objective, as described by senior military sources, would not be punitive. It would not be declared as an act of war. It would be framed as isolation, limiting the movement, resupply, and reinforcement of U.S. forces operating in the Arctic theater without direct confrontation. This alone marks a profound shift. Naval analysts explain that the North Atlantic is not an open ocean in strategic terms. It is structured by choke points. The Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, the Labrador Sea approaches, and narrow corridors that funnel shipping and military traffic between continents. These routes are already among the most heavily monitored maritime zones in the world. To isolate forces in this environment does not require sealing every passage. It requires presence, surveillance, and the credible ability to interdict if necessary. European commanders stress that no decision has been made. What is underway is contingency planning. That distinction matters. But contingency planning itself sends a signal. Historically, blockades occupy a dangerous legal and political space. They are acts of pressure that stop short of open combat, but are rarely perceived as neutral by those affected. During the Cold War, naval containment was directed outward, toward adversaries. It was never seriously contemplated against an ally. If such a move were implemented, even partially, it would represent a rupture in post-war Atlantic security architecture. U.S. officials have declined to comment directly. A Pentagon spokesperson stated only that freedom of navigation remains a core principle of American defense policy. No reference was made to NATO deliberations. Behind closed doors, military-to-military communication channels remain open, but sources describe them as strained and narrowly focused on deconfliction, avoiding collisions, misidentifications, and escalation at sea. From a technical perspective, Naval isolation in the North Atlantic would rely heavily on undersea capabilities. Submarines, sonar arrays, and maritime patrol aircraft would play a larger role than surface ships alone. These systems operate largely unseen, which increases both their effectiveness and the risk of misunderstanding. Experts warn that once undersea assets are maneuvering in proximity, signals become ambiguous. Silence itself can be interpreted as intent.
This is the strategic environment now being navigated.
While alliance leaders debate containment at sea, the effects of the crisis are increasingly visible at home, particularly in the United States. Public reaction is fractured. In several major cities, protests have formed calling for immediate de-escalation and withdrawal from Greenland. Demonstrators cite alliance obligations, constitutional authority, and the risk of wider war. These gatherings are largely peaceful, though emotions are high. At the same time, support rallies are taking place. Participants express concern over national security, Arctic competition, and what they view as long-term strategic neglect. They argue that decisive action, though controversial, was necessary. Between these poles is a large segment of the population expressing confusion. Polling conducted overnight suggests that many Americans were unaware of Greenland's strategic significance prior to this week. Awareness is rising rapidly, but understanding lags behind events. Information is arriving faster than it can be processed. That gap creates space for speculation. Social media platforms are saturated with competing narratives. Some exaggerate the scale of fighting. Others dismiss the crisis entirely. Federal agencies have urged caution, emphasizing reliance on verified sources and warning of foreign influence campaigns designed to inflame divisions. There is evidence those campaigns are already active. Cybersecurity firms report increased activity targeting American discourse, amplifying both pro- and anti-government messaging. The objective, analysts say, is not persuasion, but polarization. Domestic political leaders are responding unevenly. Some members of Congress are calling for emergency hearings. Others are urging unity and patience. The White House has promised a national address, but no time has been confirmed. For military families, the uncertainty is personal. Bases associated with Arctic operations report heightened alert levels. Leave has been restricted in some units. Communication with deployed personnel is sporadic, in part due to satellite disruptions already documented. None of this indicates mobilization for large-scale war, but it does reflect preparation for prolonged tension. Historically, public opinion during crises evolves in stages: initial shock, rapid alignment or opposition, then fatigue. How leadership communicates during the early phase often determines which direction dominates. So far, messaging has been fragmented. Internationally, observers are watching American domestic response closely. Allies gauge resolve. Rivals assess cohesion. Markets factor sentiment into risk calculations. The internal and external dimensions of this crisis are now inseparable. As NATO commanders debate maritime containment, as diplomats attempt to reopen channels, and as publics struggle to interpret events unfolding far from familiar geography, one reality remains consistent. Escalation is rarely the result of a single decision. It is usually the accumulation of constrained choices made under pressure. At this hour, no blockade has been declared. No shots have been fired between allies. Those facts matter, but so does the trajectory. We will continue to monitor confirmed developments at sea, within alliance deliberations, and across domestic response as this situation evolves. We are entering a phase of the situation that until now existed largely in contingency planning and strategic posturing. Overnight reports from multiple monitoring sources indicate that the first confirmed exchange of fire between NATO forces and U.S. military units operating in Greenland has occurred. This is preliminary, and details remain sparse. Radio communications picked up from European patrol vessels describe warning shots directed at unidentified aerial targets. At least one source, an official speaking on background to NATO command, describes short-range engagement of force-identified vehicles intended to prevent further advance into contested zones. At this point, there is no verified information of casualties. No independent media or ground observers have confirmed damage or injuries. Yet the significance is profound. For the first time, the Alliance's collective defense apparatus has been activated in direct opposition to a founding member. The implications for command protocols, deconfliction procedures, and alliance cohesion cannot be overstated. Observers caution that this initial exchange may have been deliberately limited, calibrated to signal resolve without triggering full-scale combat. Nevertheless, the Arctic environment amplifies even small actions. Radar, satellite, and maritime systems already operating under stress are now under additional operational load. Communications remain intermittent. Visibility is constrained by polar darkness, severe weather, and electromagnetic interference. Analysts emphasize that misinterpretation of any signal, friendly or adversarial, could escalate the incident rapidly. Simultaneously, the region's infrastructure is experiencing failures of increasing severity. Satellite telemetry indicates that multiple polar orbiting communication and observation satellites have gone offline or are experiencing persistent jamming. This includes Earth observation platforms, weather monitoring systems, and navigation satellites critical for maritime and aviation safety. Ground-based radar arrays across Greenland, Iceland, and Northern Europe report intermittent outages. Internet connectivity across remote Arctic communities has collapsed. Redundancies designed for harsh environments are failing under combined physical and electronic stress. Civilian and military operators alike describe this as systemic degradation. The cumulative effect is a near-total disruption of situational awareness. Aircraft, both manned and unmanned, operate with reduced navigational reliability. Surface and subsurface naval units report intermittent sonar and communication gaps. Emergency coordination among northern communities, research stations, and deployed personnel is increasingly challenging. Danish authorities confirm that remote settlements in Greenland are experiencing not only evacuation delays, but also gaps in medical and logistical support. They describe the situation as manageable but fragile, emphasizing that even minor accidents or miscommunications could have outsized consequences. From a technical perspective, Arctic systems are interdependent. Satellites enable radar tracking, which in turn informs naval and aviation command networks. Internet and satellite links allow coordination of energy infrastructure, supply chains, and emergency response. When multiple nodes fail simultaneously, the effect is multiplicative, not linear. Experts describe the region now as functionally blind, noting that Arctic operations have always carried risk due to environmental challenges, but never under conditions of multi-domain system failure while active military exchanges are ongoing. Globally, analysts are tracking both the strategic and economic consequences. Energy markets continue to respond to instability in northern transport corridors, while insurers suspend coverage for Arctic shipping and resource operations. Telecommunication providers and space agencies are recalibrating orbital assignments and rerouting critical data traffic. These actions mitigate some impact, but cannot replace the lost visibility over operational theaters. In Washington, the White House has convened an emergency national security briefing, though no public address has yet been issued. Pentagon spokespersons reiterate that forces in Greenland are executing defensive operations to secure critical assets, but they acknowledge that operational conditions are more constrained than initially anticipated. European military leaders counter that U.S. advances are now actively contested, framing their actions as enforcement of alliance-mandated boundaries. Diplomatic channels remain open, but are strained. Every statement is carefully phrased to avoid appearing provocative, but the language nonetheless confirms the reality of confrontation. Civilian populations in the Arctic, already undergoing evacuation, now face heightened uncertainty. Fuel, food, and medical supplies are limited by infrastructure collapse. Communication outages mean that traditional channels for updates and instructions are intermittent. Local authorities describe improvising with radio relays, satellite phones where available, and emergency coordination via icebreakers and aircraft. But gaps remain. Indigenous and remote communities are particularly vulnerable, with limited redundancy in supply chains and emergency services. Internationally, observers in Moscow and Beijing are analyzing these events for strategic advantage. Russia has increased reconnaissance and patrol flights along the Arctic coastline, positioning naval assets near key choke points. China has announced expanded polar research and satellite monitoring operations, citing scientific necessity, but signaling readiness to exploit emerging gaps. Both nations remain formally non-engaged, but analysts stress that the alliance fracture, combined with US-NATO hostilities, has shifted the Arctic from a cooperative theater into a contested strategic space. From a historical perspective, the combination of first fire incidents, infrastructure collapse, and Arctic environmental constraints presents a scenario with few direct precedents. Cold War-era near misses, such as submarine shadowing incidents and radar misidentifications, provide some operational analogs, but those were managed under largely functioning communication and surveillance networks. The current environment, multi-domain failure compounded by active engagement, increases risk far beyond historical norms. Experts in escalation management emphasize that the next 24 hours are critical. Limited engagements, unverified signals, and infrastructure failures may interact unpredictably. Military and civilian planners must navigate compressed decision cycles with incomplete information. Coordination, deconfliction, and redundancy are being tested simultaneously, creating a high-stakes environment where even small errors can have disproportionate consequences. For listeners at home, the implications are layered. There is no current threat to continental safety, but the Arctic has global significance. Satellite navigation and weather monitoring support aviation, shipping, and emergency response worldwide. Radar coverage in the North Atlantic underpins missile warning and strategic planning. Communications failures in Greenland and surrounding territories ripple through both military and civilian systems, highlighting how interconnected modern infrastructure has become. At this hour, no full-scale combat has broken out beyond the initial skirmish. NATO and US commanders report localized exchanges intended to enforce movement restrictions, maintain territorial claims, and prevent escalation into populated areas. Political leadership emphasizes restraint, yet the simultaneous degradation of critical systems constrains options and increases the probability of unintended escalation. This remains an extremely fluid situation. We are monitoring verified communications, satellite and radar status reports, NATO and U.S. military briefings, European defense statements, and local Arctic reporting. Our priority is to provide accurate, measured updates while acknowledging uncertainty at every step. This is Silent Waves. Alex Mercer continuing live reporting. The situation in the Arctic has entered a critical phase. For the first time, international leaders are making urgent public appeals for a ceasefire. Reports indicate that the number of confirmed casualties, both military and civilian, is rising. Greenlandic emergency services, Danish authorities, and NATO liaison officers have begun coordinating humanitarian corridors. But access is hampered by disrupted communications, limited transportation, and ongoing military activity. The numbers remain provisional. We are receiving sporadic updates, and verification is ongoing. Statements from world leaders emphasize urgency. The United Nations Secretary General called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and full respect for civilian safety, urging all parties to prioritize diplomacy over military action. European Union officials described the situation as precarious and escalating, requesting a rapid return to negotiation frameworks. Even in Washington, high-ranking officials have signaled support for pause and review, framing the objective as minimizing further casualties and restoring stability. Despite these calls, the operational reality on the ground remains tense. Limited exchanges between NATO forces and U.S. units continue in northern Greenland, with engagements described as tactical in scope but symbolically significant. Satellite data suggests ongoing interference and partial shutdowns of Arctic monitoring systems, including radar, communications, and meteorological platforms. That degradation complicates ceasefire enforcement, humanitarian access, and long-term risk assessment. Civilian evacuation efforts continue under extreme logistical constraints. Communities dependent on seasonal resupply face delays, and emergency shelters are operating at or near capacity. Authorities emphasize that no settlement is being abandoned, but the psychological strain is mounting. Health and nutrition support are being prioritized for vulnerable populations, with contingency plans for further displacement if hostilities persist. Meanwhile, analysts are beginning to assess the broader implications of the Greenland conflict. Some warn that the crisis may mark a fundamental shift in the post-World War II alliance system. NATO, historically the cornerstone of transatlantic security, has now confronted the unprecedented scenario of active conflict between a member state and the alliance itself. Scholars of international relations caution that the precedents being set in Greenland could redefine how alliances are maintained, how sovereignty is asserted, and how collective defense is interpreted in an increasingly multipolar world. Global powers beyond NATO are already reacting. Russia has emphasized the importance of maintaining stability while simultaneously expanding reconnaissance and logistical presence in the Arctic. China continues to pursue Arctic research operations, highlighting the commercial and strategic advantages of an unsettled environment. These maneuvers are framed publicly as routine, yet analysts interpret them as opportunistic positioning during a period of alliance fracture. Energy and shipping sectors remain sensitive. Arctic transport routes continue to be suspended or rerouted, insurance coverage is limited, and fuel futures remain volatile due to the compounded uncertainty. Telecommunications and navigation systems are intermittently disrupted. Civilian and commercial operators are advised to monitor verified sources and rely on contingency planning where possible. The calls for ceasefire are clear, but the path to resolution is uncertain. Military postures remain active, systems remain degraded, and trust between key actors is low. Humanitarian corridors are partial, reliant on limited communications and Arctic-capable vessels. Diplomats continue shuttle efforts, but success will depend on slowing operational tempo, restoring basic situational awareness, and establishing mutual guarantees for restraint. For listeners, the key takeaway is measured awareness. Casualty numbers are rising, systems remain fragile, and the strategic consequences extend far beyond the Arctic. The current crisis is not simply regional. It represents a test of alliance structures, the limits of coordinated defense, and the resilience of global systems built over decades. Tonight, we've followed developments from Greenland and the wider Arctic, from military operations to alliance fractures, from humanitarian concerns to the global strategic implications that continue to unfold. Facts remain emerging, verification remains ongoing, and the situation remains fluid. Our role has been to provide measured, continuous updates without speculation, keeping you informed while uncertainty persists. As always, rely on official statements and verified sources, remain aware of evolving guidance from authorities, and consider the broader implications carefully. The Arctic crisis is not over, and its effects will resonate far beyond the immediate theater. This is Silent Waves. I'm Alex Mercer. Stay alert, stay informed, and maintain the signal.